A hard rain pounded the roof of the big house, as if the sky itself meant to scrub the place clean. Lightning tore the low clouds in two and revealed for a breath the columns and broad porch of Colonel Leighton's estate, standing stark against the dark. Inside, in a parlor lined with heavy drapes and walnut cases of family silver, men who owned land and law spoke in low, confident tones. Upstairs, in a small room with a single shuttered window, a man who commanded 20,000 acres of cotton slept with the kind of watchfulness that had nothing to do with rest. 40 nights would change him. 40 nights of voices and tremors, of small betrayals and patient designs, would empty his pride until he became a cautionary shape of himself. A once mighty colonel reduced to tremor and superstition. This is the story told in the hush between thunderbolts. Voices in the dawn, 40 nights, and a colonel was never the same again. This account is a dramatization inspired by oral histories and tradition. The events and characters that follow are presented as a fictional reconstruction rooted in the patterns and pressures of Mississippi, 1860. Mississippi in 1860 smelled of wet earth and cotton. The river moved slow as a living thing, and the economy of whole counties pulsed to the rhythm of the ginning season. Plantations were small kingdoms, the big house at the top, overseers on its margins, the fields in a geometry of rose and toil. Within that world, the law was often what a man declared in his parlor, and the violence he could arrange to enforce it. Colonel Leighton occupied such a throne. He was a tall man, lean with a jaw like a plowshare, and a voice that could silence a room. He kept close accounts, appointed judges to local benches, and his name sat on deeds like an iron seal. Yet what people in the county whispered, when they were not shaking hands in the dining rooms that reaffirmed their status, was another matter. A planter's authority had to be performed by day and guarded by night. There were habits no visitor saw. The candle lit at 3 in the morning and then snuffed after a long moment of kneeling. The brass key that always lay on the right in his vest pocket. The way he would walk each hallway alone, testing locks as if to remind himself they were still there to hold the world together. Pride sat beside fear. Pride kept him seated in the front pew. Fear made him check the shutters twice. In the quarters, Teresa watched. Born in the shadow of the big house, she was small in stature but immense in attentiveness. Service had taught her an economy of movements, how to carry a tea tray without letting a single tendril of steam betray where it came from, how to carry news without being noticed, how to learn the face of a man who believed himself unreadable. She had learned to track patterns because patterns were the only things the masters believed to be immutable. You learned the bell tones, the order of their hats, the way a certain laugh meant a certain mood. Teresa learned the colonel's rhythms as one learns the weather, by counting. Tobias was her brother by blood, and by the quiet of shared childhood in the same cramped cabin in the quarters. He was younger by more than 10 years, and had the quick, tentative smile of a person who halts where danger begins. Tobias had been given a place in the accounting stable. He tallied bales and recorded measures in a ledger that belonged to the overseer. His hands were steady, his head honest. One afternoon, in a flash of distraction and fatigue, a figure of 200 bales on Tobias's column lost a small digit. The mistake was like a shrimp in a river full of fish, small and yet impossible to ignore when the net was checked. Punishments were not metaphors on the plantation, they were a public language. The overseer pronounced Tobias's error in the yard where the picket line of servants had been called to see. The colonel, who liked to make an example of order, insisted the boy be made to stand under the sun for an hour, with his counting tools exposed and his head bowed. He would not have his ledgers besmirched, he said. The people needed to see the price of inattention. The sentence might have been less violent than some, but the ritual of exposure was the point. Tobias's shame was for lesson, for spectacle. Teresa watched it from the edge of the crowd, hands folded, face still, while the lashes of the sun made shadows across the yard. She felt something unlatching in her chest, a fracture that would not be quieted by mourning alone. She spoke of it afterward to no one. In the quarters, words travel by seams. Someone's look, a half-made pot set down, a foot falling silent. Teresa told herself that silence was strategy. She had learned to disappear in plain sight. Now she would make that invisibility count. The act she planned was not a sudden fury, but an architecture of small, precise faults, a slow undermining like taking out a keystone brick by brick. Her aim was not to murder, nor to enact an old vengeance, but to make public authority crumble under its own contradictions. She would operate in the margins the masters never taught to protect. There were older women in the quarters who kept secret things. None was more careful than Ruth, whom everyone called Ma Ruth, not as a household title, but as a courtesy born of years and of hands that had touched more lives than most. She had the look of someone who was always listening. Her memory was stitched with names and recipes and the weather of whole decades. When Teresa had asked about herbs once for a fever that had passed through their family, Ma Ruth had lifted a leaf and hummed in a way that meant not to speak plainly. She had taught Teresa how to boil the root of sassafras for a rash, to steep willow bark for pain, and to read the subtle difference between remedy and poison, not by formula, but by caution. Plant knowledge was old as memory. It lived in hands and in stories. Among the grasses and the overlooked growth around the riverbanks grew a plant they called jimsonweed, also moonseed by some, and in the hush of the quarters its name was spoken with a reluctance. Ma Ruth never called it an answer to everything. "This thing will turn a man inward," she told Teresa once, "if you know how to set it. It makes him hear what he fears when he sleeps. But be careful. It can take the mind as easily as it makes it open." Teresa listened and counted the warning in her own way. Caution would be the scaffold of her plan. In the dramatization of events, plant extracts such as preparations from jimsonweed were used carefully by those who knew how to measure, supplying unsettled sleep and peculiar dreams when administered in small amounts over nights. This is not to claim modern medical certainty about effects. It is to say that within the story, an herbal preparation became a tool among others. The big house was not a single simple volume of space. It breathed through hidden seams, servant roots behind wainscots, a dumbwaiter that creaked and could bear a tray, a narrow service stair that whisper steps could run up and down at 3 in the morning. Teresa had spent years in those back corridors. In a closet that had been barely used, behind a row of cedar chests, she found what she would later think of as the instrument of anonymous accusation, a shallow ventilation shaft that ran between the attic near the master's bedchamber and the rear chimney. It was not built to carry voice, and yet voice is resourceful. Sound could travel along a hollow like river water, finding a channel. In the right conditions, a whisper placed at the right mouth of that shaft could bloom as a half-heard moan in another room. She tested it at first with practicalities. A pin dropped at the top and a dog barking below. The hollow shifted tones, emphasized certain pitches and swallowed others. Teresa learned the geometry of it by plugging one end with her palm and listening at the other. With a strip of cloth she made a tiny reed that, when blown, produced a thin, tremulous note. She borrowed tin from the kitchen and made a little scraper. Sounds, she realized, could be given a source that belonged to nothing in the parlor and everything in the mind. Her plan had layers. 1. Make small misalignments in the Colonel's expectation so that he would begin to question the solidity of what he knew. A quill left on the wrong side of a ledger. A seal moved an inch to the east of the inkwell. The lock of the library chest slightly ajar in the morning. 2. Create auditory anomalies that suggested intrusion, but left no footprint. The ventilation shaft would do this. 3. Apply gentle physiological pressure, the slow erosion of sleep through micro-interventions, a drink that tasted of sugar and honey and left the sleeper restless. Ma Ruth methodically taught her how to make an infusion that, in minute quantities, could ripple the edges of a man's nights without flattening him in a single dose. Teresa was careful. Each step had to be plausible as mischance. She practiced with Tobias once in the way two people test a net. They set a cup of water behind a sill and then moved it a hair under the Colonel's written view. He found it the next morning and muttered but dismissed it as fatigue. Small aberrations quickened his muscles, set his fingertips to worry at things that had before been settled. She learned the rhythm of his waking like a second map. He rose from bed not at dawn but at odd intervals, lit a lamp and walked the hall, stopping at a particular painting and staring as if the face in the portrait might step down and accuse him of something unsaid. Night after night, Teresa and a few others executed tiny disruptions. A drawer of the bedside table would be pulled open the width of a thumb. A shawl would be rearranged on the back of a chair. The colonel's wife, a woman with a proud carriage and careful knitting hands, might notice and scold in a tone that suggested foolishness rather than alarm. It was essential that the household interpreted these incidents as a decline of attention, not as a direct assault. The master's authority depended on such attributions. If anything appeared to threaten the external system, theft, sabotage, a servant conspiracy, the response would be harsher and more violent. It was safer, strategically, that he believed the problem was internal. His mind, his failing memory, some ailment. The nights began to impose themselves on him. Sleep frayed at the edges. He lit the 3 a.m. candle and then went downstairs to check the shutters, or else he would find himself standing in the parlor at odd hours, convinced he had heard a child sobbing under the floor, and the servants would look up and ask if he were ill. "I have been troubled in my sleep," he confided to a visiting judge from the county, as if confessing a private religious trial. The judge nodded and quoted scripture about vigilance and tested faith, and the colonel took the chorus as confirmation that his ordeal had meaning. Teresa watched this too. She had learned that the colonel needed meaning given to him, for the marrow of his pride was a religious certainty. That belief could be bent to supply the kind of torment she required. There were days when the plan demanded nothing more than the pace of patience. Teresa kept to her duties in the big house, polishing the brass, arranging cloths, tending the iron kettle. She read faces as other people read weather. The colonel's smile grew brittle. At breakfast he misplaced his napkin and accused a footman of theft. The footman swore and was dismissed to his duties with a look that would shape him for weeks. Small exiles were pruning the house of solidity. But small pricks would not have been enough. The plant preparation, administered in careful measures to the colonel's nightly brandy or the water he sipped before bed, produced a sequence of nights where dreams were sharper, and waking came with a heaviness of thought. Teresa sealed the measure with the kind of devotion that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with concealment. She watched from the shadows as the candle burned down and as he drank alone. The first nights nothing seemed to be different. The colonel rose and cursed his nerves and walked the floor. In the third week, he began to hear voices in the long dark hours that neither his wife nor the overseer could confirm. Voices were strange things in a house of many mouths. A servant could speak in a corridor and be heard only as a rustle. But when a voice came through a vent, the brain was forced to invent context. A whisper from between the walls could be a draught, a mouse, a memory, or a conscience. People will interpret the same shiver in the night as either a ghost or as hunger. Leighton began to interpret it as guilt. He would wake convinced that the boy Tobias was calling his name in the distance, or that an old man he had once humiliated had come back to make an account. He began to go to the front windows at the first light and peer into the yard with a ferocity that made his wife look away. The overseer, a bulk of a man named Hargrove, smelled the trouble and proposed practical remedies. "We'll set a watch," he told the colonel, and the colonel said yes, with the kind of barked assent that promised an immediate return to order. They tried to station 2 men in the hall at night, but their boots were broad and their sleep was heavy. The colonel grew impatient with their sloth. He would walk the house himself until his feet went numb. The household staff did what they could to make the disturbances seem less mysterious. They mended loose floorboards, soothed creaky hinges, and when the colonel demanded, they searched each locked closet as if someone had moved a treasured thing. Nothing was found. The evidence of intrusion was always the kind that meant nothing but suggested everything. There were evenings when the colonel's public composure buckled in a way that made Teresa's chest tighten. At a gathering for a neighboring planter's funeral, where men who thought little of cruelty gathered to measure their grief in pewter cups, he startled and stood up from his chair as if someone had touched him. He clapped a hand over his mouth, went outside, and paced under the live oaks until dawn. Those were nights when gossip had a fever. Stories spread, as stories do, shaped by rumor into something larger than truth. The colonel, whose name had been a shield, now had the first crack running through it. Teresa's heart did not leap at the crack. She kept to her plan's arithmetic. Each event was a proof, not an exhilaration. Preservation was an aim larger than revenge. She thought of the plantation's economy. Debts that eke dry leaves clung to the winter fences. Ledgers that could be turned by a single night of public shame. into foreclosure and sale. A man's mind unseated would cost him more than pride. It would cost him credit and confidence, and if the county's gentleman had no appetite for a leader of erratic temper, his place in the social order. In the months of her life she had seen how the social web that sustained a planter was only as strong as the impressions others kept of him. Break that impression, and the rest, the ledgers and the land, could fray. Teresa was not alone in this work. There were hands that bent the edges of a slip of paper, eyes that watched the colonel cross the lawn at odd hours to be sure he had not changed his pattern. Among them, young women and men who had reason to learn the shape of a lie. Tobias aided by small movements that were plausible as accident, a pallet of soot in the seam of a hearth, a candle that seemed to sputter because a draught had been opened. Ma Ruth, who disliked being seen, would pass by in the afternoon and talk of nothing, while the conversation contained everything. "You watch the moon," she would say, and the meaning was known. "Mark the nights. Note their weight." The nights paved forward. Teresa kept a count carved into an old box in the quarters with a hairpin, a notch for each night of minor claim on the colonel's consciousness, one notch after the next, 10 nights of small disturbances and a fraying temper. 20 nights and the colonel began to reach for his Bible the way a drowning man reaches for a board, not because he clung to doctrine, but because ritual could be a buoy. He read aloud at odd pauses now, the passages about transgression and repentance ringing through the house with a ferocity that awed visitors and unsettled his wife. There came to be moments when his mind split in public in ways that required immediate repair. At a Sunday meal with a circuit preacher invited as a courtesy, the colonel flinched and accused the steward of misplacing his ledger, then demanded to inspect the ledger and called the steward a liar. The man stood there in public, palms white, while the circle of gentlemen shifted their weight and considered whether the colonel's temper was merited or a fault of the steward. Social calculation is a fast, precise business. If the men thought the colonel lost his reason, they would hedge their bets and begin to save the stuff of bank credits. The colonel's outward performance of authority was becoming a brittle thing. Inside the house, the whispering through the vent grew bolder. Teresa learned to shape it into phrases that would wedge into his imagination without forming clear accusation for others to seize upon. A breath that sounded like the scraping of a child's foot in the hall. A half-word like Tiobi that the brain might complete as Tobias if it already suspected guilt. Once, in the deep hours, the sound of a metallic clink travelled like an accusation along the vent, and the colonel woke and fired a pistol into the ceiling, the report making the silverware jump and the servants' doors fly open in a single, startled hiss of light. He sat there, shaking, his hands so unsteady he could not reload the pistol. His face was the colour of cloth that had been steeped, then left to dry. The chambermaids would later whisper that he cried like a child on the stairs that night. For Teresa, the shot was a necessary misdirection. It proved that the colonel's fear was not merely private. It was now a spectacle. Word reached the county in fits and fragments. There were letters between men of property, inquiries couched as concern. Leighton's creditors watched with the cautious eye of those who knew fortunes fall as quickly as weather changes. The colonel grew sharper in some ways. His mind lashed about like a caged thing, but his surface controls tightened. He made rages that were sudden, and then turned himself to a composed face of rectitude. That was the dangerous part of the plan. The colonel could retaliate at random and with intensity. An evening in which he thought himself betrayed might be answered by a whipping in the yard or the sale of a family's small things to cover an insult perceived. Teresa always accounted for the possibility of violence and for the moral heartbreak of seeing people punished for misdeeds they had not committed. She did not let herself conflate justice with destruction of innocence. Her steps were chosen to minimize such costs, but within the world she moved, costs would appear nonetheless. At the center of her design was not only the undermining of one proud man, but the unmasking of a system that had taught him to think himself invulnerable. The plantation depended on a performance of control. Once the performance was exposed as reliant on illusions of invulnerability, the web of power could loosen. That loosening could mean for the quarters an opening. Buyers refusing to purchase a property whose head had been declared unsound, a bank calling in notes, a county who would rather sell the debt-laden estate than suffer the liability of a mad captain of order in their courts. Teresa knew debt as clearly as she knew hunger. The next season's credit might be the thin thread that kept a family from being torn across a river by a sail. Make that thread shaky, and the plantation's economics would follow. Meanwhile, the colonel managed concealment with rituals that had once seemed private. He started to leave a coin on his pillow as if to pay some fee. He swore aloud in prayer before meals, and then again in the night. His wife, once a statue in a silk gown who moved through rooms like a well-placed instrument, began to doubt things in a way that made her knitting pause. She would look at the colonel in the parlors, and then at the guests and smile without knowing if the smile was for show or for fear. "He is overwrought," she would tell the neighbors, and they would nod, because it was easier to attribute the change to temperament than to imagine the house's foundations undermined by the slow work of an unseen hand. Teresa's methodical approach demanded that she keep to a schedule that felt almost like prayer. Test the hollow, note what pitch carried best, deliver the measure at dusk when the servants were tired and the house's defenses slackened. She took risks that felt tiny, a hair left in the colonel's pipe, a smear of ash on the edge of his Bible page, and waited to see how the man would interpret them. The human mind is a builder of narrative because it cannot bear ambiguity for long. It will prefer a story, however improbable, to the raw static of uncertainty. Teresa armed the static until the colonel's own narrative came undone and had to be replaced with something he could not control. There were nights when the rest of the quarters slept, and Teresa sat by the small window of the kitchen and listened to the house breathe with the slow sough of the wind. She would recall Tobias as a child, how he had once crawled into the loft to hide from rain, and she would count notches in the hollow wood where her plan was etched like a secret tally. Each notch carried a name, a night of scraping, a night of moving a candle, a night when she had let a draught suggest the presence of feet. Her hand moved slowly. She did not rejoice. The work had in it the coldness of necessary things, a surgeon's gloves on a hand that will not tremble. A danger always present was the human cost. A misstep could land someone else in the flames. Once a servant who had been given a glass of wine by mistake, meant for an overseer in the pantry, grew ill and had to be hidden away for a day. Teresa covered it and bore the risk in silence. She could not afford to lose allies through error. Ma Ruth, forever watchful, chided her when a dosage had to be cut back. "Remember," she said, "we are not the masters of life. We set edges. We do not throw people from cliffs." Teresa listened and adjusted. The line between justice and cruelty is thin, and not always visible until too late. She wanted her hands to remain those that rebuilt, rather than those that destroyed indiscriminately. As the nights multiplied and the colonel's sleep thinned, the small signs of change filtered into the county with dangerous speed. A farmer on a neighboring plantation told his wife over tea that Leighton's temper had been noticed even in the courthouse. Another man, an occasional creditor, remarked that he had seen Leighton step out onto his porch and stare at the darkness for so long that he seemed to be listening to some music only he could hear. The gossip was a tinder that could catch on either way. Some might decide the colonel was ill and must be secured. Others might see him as a man to be feared, his hand unpredictable and therefore dangerous to commerce. Both outcomes served Teresa's strategy differently. If he were deemed too dangerous, the county might remove his standing. If he were pitied, his dealings might be questioned. Each was an erosion. Night 29 passed under a harvest moon that shadowed the cotton in a silver hush. Teresa had marked 29 notches on the box, and the hairpin bristled with memory. The vent had been tuned to a new cadence, scrape, soft moan, the sound of a chain pulled through mud. The colonel, who now took to sitting in the parlor at odd hours with his Bible open as if to anchor some part of reality, rose and walked the hall. His face was creased, the skin around his mouth tight. He stopped by the portrait of an ancestor and pressed a hand to its frame as if to test the solidity of blood itself. He drank, and he spoke to the empty room with the same cadence as a preacher, as if to convert the dark into confessions. From the kitchen, Teresa heard him mutter a name that had not been spoken in years. She did not move. Outside, in the yard, the wind unthreaded the leaves, and the cotton plants rasped in a brittle chorus. The house seemed to hold its breath. In the quarters, some of the younger men, sensing the scale of what was happening but not the full plan, began to speak in whispers about what the future might bring. Would the estate be sold? Would families be split? Teresa heard those fears like a second undertow. She had calculated for the risk. She had not misread the inevitable grief. In these nights, the moral weight of what she was doing pressed on her like the humidity on the skin. There were times she imagined other outcomes, confronting the colonel openly, appealing to his peers, forcing him into public trial. But who among the county judges would want to place a planter under such scrutiny? Power protects itself. The courts were lanes into which the colonel's influence had poured like oil. He could name jurors, and sit with men who would nod the way dutiful acquaintances nod. She had seen how the law might be arranged to protect him. So her choice was a quieter retribution. Make the man's mind the theatre where justice could be wrought, when law would not touch it. The nights moved toward the 40th like a tide. Teresa thought of that number often. It had a biblical weight in the mouths of the people who read scripture for comfort and curse alike, but she did not allow superstition to determine action. 40 to her was simply an ordinal marker of time and progress. She kept working in the ways she could. A note slid under the colonel's door with a single line of childish handwriting, a plate repositioned so that the shadow fell where it should not. Each tick was a small chisel. One morning near dawn, and with the rain still marking time on the leaves, the colonel stumbled into the yard and called the overseer before breakfast. He spoke so loudly that the women sewing on the back porch looked up. He accused someone of stealing his silk handkerchief, and then, when no one admitted it, smashed the shank of a chair against a post, as if to dispel the invisible thief. The spectacle made the visiting men shift their seats and forced a hush across breakfast conversation. The colonel's voice carried a flavor of panic that the others had not heard before. Teresa watched from the kitchen door, a broom in her hand, and felt the narrowness in her chest again. She had not wanted a spectacle like this, too public, too likely to provoke a direct, brutal answer, but the performance was now set to its own rhythm. The colonel's unraveling had its own momentum, and sometimes such momentum takes a direction that requires delicate correction. She would have to be faster in the nights to come, more careful in how she distributed the measures, lest the fallout break more than the man. Even so, there was an ugly satisfaction that matched the moral sorrow. Someone who had watched over others with a hand of iron was beginning to find that his own iron finger had loosened. He who had measured and punished now measured his own breathing and found it wanting. The big house felt different. The rooms seemed to listen. Even in the quarters, where people had been trained to ward their faces and swallow their impressions, the air had shifted. There was a new thirst in conversations, a different timbre in the way children played at the edge of the yard. Teresa swept and kept her pose of ordinary labor. In a small pocket of silence, she smiled like someone who had been given a ledger with both sides of an accounting finally balanced. Not for triumph, but for the bitter satisfaction that an implacable order could be questioned. She lifted a shard of a broken crystal from a threshold and kept it in her hand, as if to weigh its edge. The colonel had not yet fallen. The house had not yet been sold. The county had not yet sided. But the tone had changed. Voices had entered the dawn. In the weeks that followed, the vent's whispering grew more precise and the colonel's reactions more ungovernable. He began to leave notes for himself in a code of capitals and crooked script, expecting that he might forget where he had set his own name. At times he sat with his back to the window and listened as if the world itself might recant its business and confess some hidden complicity. The plan rode the edge of lawlessness and moral calculation, of justice performed where justice would not come. And then came the night when, in the hush between two rainfalls, Teresa paused at the kitchen door and put her hand on the cool wood of the table. She counted the days once more, fingers running over the notches in the old box as if to make sure the score was correct. Something in the big house had begun to speak back. The colonel, once a man of unquestioned sureness, began to accept the possibility that he was being judged by ears that had no faces. She lifted the pot from the hearth and set it to cool. Outside, the cotton rustled in a wind that tasted of river and iron. The voices in the walls had given him no name yet in public. They were only the first layer. The slow work of dismantling the image of invulnerability continued, and with each night the stakes grew more visible, creditors waiting, men in the county measuring the quality of his commands, a wife whose doubts were now a pale, steady ache. Teresa tipped the water away and remembered Tobias's bowed head in the yard, and the way the sun had made a halo of shame around him. She felt the small, cold satisfaction of a thing done for the sake of the many. Darkness tightened, and the big house prepared for another night. The hollow in the wall would carry a new sound. The cup she set by the Colonel's bed would taste the same as the last. She had one strategy left to calibrate, a change in cadence, a careful raising of the whisper's pitch to convert suggestion into a narrative he could not escape. The nights were counting down toward an event whose shape she could now see but not yet pronounce. The plantation slept around her, its breath uneven, and Teresa listened for the morning that might come with business changed, or blood split, or both. Outside a cricket rasped. From the hollow between the rafters came the faintest scrape, a single deliberate note that might have been any number of things, a mouse, a settling board, a man's old conscience moving. Inside the house the Colonel turned in his bed, an eyelid flickering like a shutter. In the kitchen a shadow moved and then did not. Teresa set the broom against the wall, and for a long instant allowed herself the sensation of standing on the edge between what was and what would be. The dawn would bring its own witnesses. The voices had only begun to be heard. If this story stirs something in you, can intelligence be a more powerful weapon than force? Tell us in the comments. The nights after the 30th notch took on a rhythm that felt like a living thing. The house, which had once been a theater of command, now housed an actor in decline, and the rest of the players learned to measure their lines around his lapses. In the quarters there were quiet councils by lantern light, adjustments of dosage, new angles of sound, tests of where a footfall might be heard, and what tone would make a gasp more likely than an accusation. They refined the vent's language until it could say not a full sentence but a suggestion that lodged. Teresa moved through those dark days with the care of someone carrying a lantern over a field of roots. She still polished, still folded linens, still answered questions in the parlor with a practiced face. But after chores she would return to a private geography, the shaft, the notch box, a scrap of cloth that softened the pitch of a whistle. She became an engineer of suggestion, and the work required her to imagine what a proud man might fear more than anything else. There were truths she could not change, his land, his neighbor's willingness to believe him, but she could bend his world into question. The Colonel's reactions grew less ordered. Where once he had been a steady drum of imperative, he now struck at phantoms with the anger of a man trying to excuse his tremors. He woke one night and accused a visiting minister of speaking in tongues at him. He woke another, and convinced that someone had covered the stairs with soft cloth to make him slip into embarrassment in front of guests, threw down chairs and demanded explanations. It was as if every small misalignment Teresa had invented multiplied into a lattice of possible betrayals, and he tried to strike at all of them. At times he sought sanctuary in scripture, reading aloud in the parlor with a voice that shook whole sentences into the air. At others he became litigious in his paranoia, writing ill-tempered notes to his steward and to a neighbor who had once crossed him in a boundary dispute. The letters he sent were formal and vicious, and the recipients kept quiet about them, knowing the value of tact in a county where property and reputation overlapped. But inside those letters there was a tone that made bankers look twice at the credit he relied on. Inside those letters there was worry enough for rumor and suspicion to smell like smoke. Hargrove, the overseer, grew restless in a way Teresa had not fully predicted. He was a man whose authority derived from carrying out orders, and when those orders began to run against a master's erratic nights, Hargrove's prudence split into two. He would either double down on enforcement or he would hedge against the man he served. For a while he doubled down. More patrols through the halls, more admonitions to the servants to keep watch, more complaints made to the county doctor when the Colonel's complaints grew public. But when the Colonel began to blame Hargrove himself, accusing him of sloth and treachery in private outbursts, the overseer's alignment began to fray. Loyalty in that world is a chain that snaps for reasons of self-preservation. Hargrove began to calculate which side of the house would survive a disgrace. Teresa watched all of this as if it were a map whose borders she had helped redraw. She did not discount the mortal consequences of miscalculation. She concealed the times when a dosage had been misapplied. She kept a watch for any servant who showed signs of weakness after a drink meant for a man of weight. When an apprentice cook grew faint after a spill of flavored water, Teresa carried him to Ma Ruth's back room and watched while the old woman unrolled her knowledge like a bandage. There were moments of fear that a misstep would cleave the community. There were nights when Teresa lay awake and heard in her mind the count of possible losses. She kept her hand steady because she had learned that steadiness sometimes held more mercy than rage. Her goal was to unseat a man who had been made untouchable, not to shred the people who had attached themselves to the property he managed. The county began to notice. Men who had once exchanged pleasantries with Colonel Leighton at a circuit court or a harvest supper now found reason to keep their distance in business. A dry goods merchant, who had accepted the colonel's bills for years, told a friend that he had seen Leighton walking at night and muttering to the dark. A lawyer who had often drawn deeds for the colonel's estate now recommended caution to his partners. The first formal tremor came in a short civil notice from a bank, an inquiry, phrased as concern, about the colonel's ability to sustain a line of credit that had been renewed for his next year's ginning. The notice read itself like a question no man of pride wanted to answer. Teresa had counted on this. The social machinery of power in the county rested on impressions. A man's steadiness made men lend, neighbors serve on his jury, and clients sign off on his investments. Fracture his steadiness, and you fracture the flow of trust that undergirded his economy. Still, the collapse she desired required an audience. A private madness would only become a ruin if known. And for that, she needed a night that contained witnesses. The occasion arrived not by accident but by plan. Colonel Leighton, seeing the need to reassert his position and to host a circle of county men who would be urged to dismiss recent rumors, arranged a dinner at the big house, a congregation of the county's decision-makers, judges, planters, a couple of merchants, and a pair of lawyers whose signatures often set the terms for credit. He wanted witnesses to his vigor and to the solidity of his mind. He wanted, in short, to perform his recovery. Teresa heard of the dinner like one hears a bell toll for a strategy. It was the perfect stage, and his desire to perform his resilience would supply the ingredients necessary to convert private uncertainty into public spectacle. She and Ma Ruth worked with a new delicacy. The doses had to be measured down to the margin. A larger measure might render him incoherent, but a certain calibrated strain could remove the anchors of sleep and let the mind build grotesque narratives from suggestion. The vent work would be tuned to produce sounds that suggested movement in the parlor, without giving any one man on the staff the ability to testify to an origin. A scrap of lace would be placed upon the colonel's armchair in a way that he might interpret as a claim left by an intruder. A false note, written in a child's crooked hand and slid beneath his dining napkin, would speak of misdeeds and of the name the colonel feared most, Tobias. Everything had to be the sort of thing a man might blame himself for, or might fear others had conspired to make public. On the afternoon of the dinner, the big house shone with the prepared glint of good silver and the well-pressed linen of hospitality. The colonel's wife moved among the rooms like someone rehearsing a life that had been planned for a particular spectacle of control. Her hands were steady, her smile prepared, but the eyes above the smile were betraying a quieter disquiet. The guests arrived in carriages that churned the drive down in dust, their boots ringing on the porch as if to mark the boundary between public and private. They seated themselves in the parlor and drank and exchanged the small talk of men who were both kin and creditors. At the head of the table, Leighton presided with a perfunctory ease, a man intent on proving the solidity that rumor had questioned. Teresa moved like a shadow among the household, unseen. She would not sit among the servants on the night of the dinner. She had to keep a distance sufficient to ensure she was not suspected. Instead, she stationed herself behind a linen closet door with the vent at the palm of her hand, a scrap of cloth to soften the sound, and a depth of patience she had honed over months. Ma Ruth waited in a back room with a quiet bowl at her feet, ready to improvise if a dosage had to be adjusted. Tobias, who had been watching the house with the unease of a man who knew his error would be used as a lesson, stood by Teresa's elbow for the final check. He was pale but steady. The line of shame that had been drawn across him months before had not been erased, but his brother's plan had given him a place in the margins of safety she had forged. As the first plates were carried in, Teresa drew breath and touched the vent as if it were a piano key. A sound like the shuffling of a child's slippers moved along the hollow and into the parlor. It was small. At first it was no more than a suggestion, easily chalked up to draft by those who wished to keep dinner polite. Leighton glanced toward the hearth and smiled a smile that tried to deny distraction. The sound repeated, gentler now, a scrape as if of metal on wood. The colonel frowned and told a neighbor that perhaps a mouse had found a seam. The neighbor answered with a chuckle that tried to sound like the laughter of rational men. The vent shifted gear. A breath as if of a far-off sob threaded into the room, and then a half-syllable that seemed like the beginning of a name. In the colonel's mind, the syllables completed themselves. He became pale and reached for his glass, drinking as if to steady himself. Conversation veered. The men took note of his agitation as a private eccentricity. Teresa had planned for this pattern, a public jolt enough to make the colonel flush his defenses and then push him into a place where he would want to justify himself before his peers. Halfway through the meal, when the colonel rose to stand and assert some dignity, there came a sound directly above, like the scraping of a chair, and then a soft metallic clink. The colonel started, his face losing color. He turned furiously to the steward and demanded to know who had entered the parlor during the meal. The steward, taken aback, protested that no one had. The guests sat in an awkward silence, each man finding a place in his own pride between denying and confirming what the colonel now claimed to suffer. Leighton's voice rose and then broke. He accused a steward of lying, and then, to the stunned astonishment of all present, turned to his wife and whispered something so fevered she clutched the edge of the table as if to steady herself. The vent's whisper moved to an unmistakable cadence, the sound of footsteps moving down a hall and a child's voice, delicate and pleading, that seemed to say a name in a half-familiar way. The colonel stuttered and then, for the first time in years, began to cry aloud in the parlor. The men, unused to seeing such weakness displayed, backed away with a bewildered politeness. A lawyer suggested medical advice, a judge offered prayers, and a planter muttered that perhaps the heat had gotten to him. But the seed of scandal had been planted. What followed was a scene both fierce and slow. Leighton stumbled from the room, pursued by his wife and Hargrove, his hands flayed by the need to hold any narrative he could. He declared at the top of his parlor stair that someone had wronged him. He accused invisible enemies and named Tobias in a way that forced the boy, who had run to him without knowing what he would face, into a public position of shame. The guests watched horrified as a man they had presumed unassailable unspooled before their eyes, and then turned their eyes to each other to measure the credibility of what they had just seen. That night the county got more than gossip. A visiting judge who had been seated near the colonel at the dinner left the supper early and sent word the next day that the colonel's behavior had been alarming and incontestable evidence of some disturbance. The phrase, couched as it was in the cautious language of gentlemen, carried weight across the county's ledger books and into the ears of the men from whom Leighton had borrowed. A bank clerk made a note. Hargrove, whose practical mind preferred to steer clear of scandal, began to arrange the colonel's affairs in a way that would allow his own back to be covered. That cover involved letters drafted in sober tones recommending restraint, medical inquiry, and, most crucially, an assessment of his fitness to manage the estate. Teresa watched the aftershocks like a farmer watching floodwater. The plan had been to displace his authority enough to break his credit and standing, and the pattern was working. Men who once sat at his table now sat at a distance on documents. Buyers of seed and supplies sent agents instead of letters. The county's network of trust, which had been threaded through the colonel's visible competence, was starting to thaw. But the city of disaster had its own horrors. The colonel's mania had already seen him fire a pistol into a ceiling once. Now, in the days after the dinner, he became more dangerous in his assurance of conspiracy. He would wander the yard at night with a lantern and a loaded pistol, peering into the darkness, as if to catch the face of an adversary. There were nights when a servant returned from a task to find the colonel drunk with fear, accusing the very people who had served him for years. Teresa's plan had not sought to make him violent in ways that would punish others, yet she could not entirely avoid consequences. When a man like Leighton lashes out, his blows can land on the wrong shoulders. True to her caution, Teresa took measures to mask culpability. When the colonel demanded in a rage that servants be brought forward and that suspects be flogged for treachery, she used private appeals, words asked in a folded note slipped to a steward and a quiet barter with Hargrove, to dissuade the most violent retributions. She argued, with the calm of someone negotiating for lives, that such lashings in a time of strain would make the county courts look askance and would bring more harm than good. Hargrove, who had begun to value his own neck more than the man he served, listened. The overseer's temper softened, and he agreed publicly to secure the house in ways that were less punitive to the laboring people and more in line with the image of order the colonel sought to maintain. Still, grief threaded the quarters like a slow river. Fear made people jittery. The threat of sale made mothers think of their children carried off to unfamiliar owners. In the world of misaligned power, the victims were many, and not every misfortune one could foresee mattered less because the other side of the ledger had been cleared. Teresa held to the intention she had named from the beginning, to displace a man whose impunity had been the instrument of many violences. But she did not pretend the path would not bruise the innocent. She kept lists, she kept cautious measures, and she tried to steer the blow in such a way that the plantation, if it were to change hands, would not split families as a matter of course. The 40th night approached with a weight that felt like a held breath. There was no attempt at theatricality in Teresa's mind. The number itself had only the meaning she gave it as a marker of cumulative erosion. Yet human beings invest numbers with old echoes. For the colonel there might be memory of a fast or a scriptural number. For Teresa there was the practical worry that a longer campaign would yield more collateral damage. She moved in the days before the final count, with the quiet of someone preparing a bridge for safe passage, testing the vent once more, measuring the last bitter drop that would be slipped into a nightcap, placing the small note with Tobias's crooked, childlike handwriting where the colonel would find it last. On the 40th night, the sky opened in a way that felt like the world holding a mirror to the events inside the big house. A rain came, not the violent shower that had begun this tale, but a steady cleansing that made the porch boards glisten and turned the drive into strips of dark. Guests who had once crowded the colonel's parlor now kept their distance by arrangement or by worry. Some came because a man with stakes in the county could not avoid the business of his debts. The colonel, more brittle than ever, insisted on a company of men that he believed would defend his standing. They arrived like phantoms of the social web he had once governed, each man wearing the clothes of civility, but carrying in their faces the count of their own calculations. Teresa set the vents reed at a pitch that would carry the most plaintive of notes. A child's sob, a chain soft as cloth rubbing against wood, the sound of someone whispering a name in an accusing loop. She lowered the final infusion and watched as the glass left at the colonel's bed caught the light. She did not savor the moment. Her hands trembled, not from triumph, but from the moral strain of what she chose to do. For Teresa, the night was a test of balance. How much weight could be placed on the scale before it tipped into irrevocable harm? Midway through the evening, as the colonel moved among his guests asserting civility, the house's auditory trickery accelerated. The vents gave up syllables that the mind supplied with meaning. Leighton clutched at his chest. He staggered in place. He seemed to try to call a name. A metallic sound echoed above, like the clink of a chain drawn across a nail. He rose too white and stumbled into the hall. The guests looked to each other, and in a moment that felt like the unraveling of silk, they saw him drop to his knees and say something about judgment and accounts. Then, without warning, he fired the pistol again, 3 times into an unseen barrage, so suddenly that silverware flew and candles guttered. One of the shots went high and struck the chandelier, dislodging a crystal that shattered onto the floor with a small crystalline clap that sounded like the breaking of the man's last armor. There ensued a chaos that had both the humiliating intimacy of a man unmasked and the public exposure of a scandal confirmed. The guests fled in a mixture of fear and the gentlemanly desire to be seen as dispassionate. The judge who had been there took refuge in a cold deliberation, recommending that the colonel be removed from his duties until assessed. A doctor was summoned, one who had dealt with fevers and melancholia, and he declared that Leighton's state required that he be secluded for his own safety. The word seclusion in that time often meant confinement in a facility or under the watch of hired keepers. It was a gentle word for a decision that would strip a man of his public charters. The next days moved with the terrible speed of legal machinery once it finds purchase in rumor. A creditor, prudent and unromantic, issued a call on an outstanding note. Another man wrote that he had diminished trust in Leighton's management. The county met its small councils and argued in careful tones about the risk of leaving a man whose faculties were unreliable in charge of assets that others had financial ties to. Hargrove, thoughtful in his own interest, arranged the practicalities, forwarding accounts, securing wagons, and taking measures to inventory crops. He did it with a face that might have once been obedience, but now carried the weight of someone preparing a retreat that might include a sale. Leighton was removed from the big house with the hushed solemnity of a man who had been both feared and now piteously reduced. He did not go voluntarily to any hospital the county offered. There were few institutions meant for such things, and those that existed were rough and poorly designated. Instead, under the discretion of men who wanted to avoid scandal without confronting its cause, he was placed in the care of a doctor in a nearby town, and from there was moved to a private house where hired attendants would keep him under watch. The language around it, convalescence, treatment, safekeeping, did little to disguise the fact that his mind had been judged a liability. What happened next was the unspooling Teresa had predicted. Buyers who had once lined up to take parcels of land now paused. The mortgage that had been renewed in a mood of confidence was questioned. Leighton's creditors, who would have previously extended mercy to a man of standing, found that their appetite for risk had been curtailed by whispers and by the very publicness of his collapse. The estate's lenders began to call in favors and to draw provisions written into contracts for just such times. The plantation's credit line was unsettled, and under pressure, the steward arranged for a sale. Sale in that world is a blunt instrument. It moves bodies by contract and redraws lives on lots. The land itself went up on the auction block not as a single blade of cotton, but as an economic unit that could be broken and parceled to satisfy debt. For the people who lived on the place, those who had cooked, sewn, birthed, and nursed in its quarters, sale was the door through which the unknown walked. Some buyers might keep certain hands together, others would purchase labor in pieces. Teresa watched the notices nailed to the courthouse door, and the steward's ledger grow heavy with numbers that translated human lives into sums. She had not wanted that eventuality. She had wanted the colonel's authority broken enough that the terms of credit and governance would change, perhaps making his estate undesirable, perhaps forcing a settlement that kept neighborhoods intact. But an economy of sales has its own logic, and when the steam of panic enters credit, that logic hardens into expediency. Families were shuddered. A neighbor's wife wept in the quarter because of the possibility of her cousin's name appearing on a docket. Teresa moved among these losses with the small private ministrations of someone who had arranged risk from the beginning. When possible, she diverted buyers from certain lots or bargained with overseers to keep certain family units together. Those were small mercies in a large disassembly. In the weeks that followed the auction, the big house changed hands in ways that spoke of the county's new appetite. It did not take a miracle to see the chain of consequences. A man's mind fractured, his credit curtailed, the estate sold. Where once Colonel's name had been stamped across deeds like proof of permanence, now it was a warning to those who invested in the solidity of men. Hargrove found his footing by negotiating with a buyer to remain as an overseer in a reduced capacity, practical survival rather than honor. The colonel's wife, whose social value had once been a currency of its own, relocated to a relative's home and took up the quiet tasks of a woman who had to maintain appearances while grieving a former life. As for Tobias, the boy whose mistake had been the match beneath the tinder, his fate was mixed. Not all of the quarter's families were broken. Some men who bought parts of the land, sober men who had worked the fields in their youth, chose to keep certain households intact because they recognized the value of keeping experienced hands together. In that small arithmetic of ethics and profit, Tobias found that his labor was still required. He remained at the plantation, not as the son once burdened by shame, but as a man who bore the careful burden of being visible enough to be protected and invisible enough to survive. He did not speak of the nights in any way that could be tied to Teresa's actions. In a world where spoken claims required proof and proof required risk, silence was the shelter that survives. Teresa did not go to the auction. She watched the changing of ownership from the margins, her heart a ledger of losses and calculations. She had wanted to loosen a man's grip on a system that had held people like her in place. She did not imagine the full reach of the consequences that would ripple from that loosening. She had measured the colonel's mind and the economy's susceptibility, but she had not given herself the soft hope that no one would pay a cost. Her satisfaction, when it came, was not light. It was the dry taste of someone who had chosen a necessary thing and who had kept both hands on the responsibility that choice entailed. In the months that followed, the big house's keys passed to a buyer who intended to rent out parts of the land and to mortgage the rest. The county's men who had once deferred to Leighton now found themselves in a county with a new equilibrium. Some of them occupied positions the colonel had vacated. Others felt the absence of his patronage as a blank that would be filled by committees and shared interests. The quarters adjusted as well as such places can adjust. A number of families stayed intact. Others were moved away in wagons that carried belongings and children and names. Life, that stubborn and persistent thing, continued. Teresa returned to the work she had always known. The broom she once kept by the kitchen door became her metonym for ordinary labor, for the choice to remain unseen. On a certain morning, when the rain had stopped and the sun turned the cotton to pale flames, she entered the big house and found a crystal bowl lying shattered where the colonel's pistol had once danced the ceiling's light. There were other shards beyond, small glittering things that spoke of a moment when a man's armor had struck a falling star and been scattered. Teresa swept the pieces into a heap with her practiced hand, feeling their cold edges nick her skin. Like all inglorious proofs, they cut in small ways. She swept slowly, not out of triumph, but because sweeping allows the mind to finish a thing. The household's new master had not yet moved in. The house itself held the scent of change and the memory of a man who had once filled every room with the authority of his pronouncements. The servants went about their tasks with the compacted knowledge that nothing is restorable to a seamless past once it has been cleaved. Children played nearer the yard's edges, a little more free in their steps, as if the absence of a constant inspection allowed for one or two more gambols in borrowed shade. Teresa kept her silence, not because the world no longer owed her anything, but because she had chosen a particular kind of invisibility. She moved among rooms with the knowledge of someone who had guided the course of men by measures small and patient, and who had paid and seen paid the ledger of consequence. There was a heaviness to the way she measured the mornings, a consciousness that vengeance and justice could look very like each other when one viewed them from the vantage of the person who must live with the aftermath. The county's gossip never fully forgave her. Rumor braided new explanations with older truths. Some said an uprising had been planned and thwarted. Others murmured that the colonel had been afflicted by a spiritual malady. No one had evidence, and that was precisely the point. A story that can be held in the mind without a trail of proof can rearrange reputations with a force that courts and lawyers cannot always redress. Teresa's hand had been small and precise, and in the absence of a confession, her action remained a shadow in the margins of official record. Years later, people would still speak in low tones about Colonel Leighton's decline. Some would add fanciful details to the tale, characters reshaping it like a folk pattern. Others would nod and say it was an emblem of the dangers of unchecked power. Historians, cautious of the fragility of memory, would question the accuracy of those accounts and offer instead explanations tied to stress and disease. But among the quarter's people, the story stayed as a private ledger. A woman who watched and who made the scale tip in a world made of unequal weights. Teresa's life settled into a quiet that was not quite peace. She married, if marriage be the right word for the arrangements people make for shelter and for kinship, and she bore children who learned to carry kettles and to spin thread. Tobias worked beside her for a time and then, seeking his own course, left to learn a tradesman's craft in town. Maruth's hands grew still and then quiet. The old woman's knowledge went into a few recipes and a small secret trust that Teresa and a couple of others guarded. When Ma Ruth's time came, they buried her under a willow near the quarters with a hush that honored both her counsel and the privacy of a woman who had taught a generation how to read roots for medicine and for solace. Teresa kept her broom, and on certain mornings would stand at the big house's threshold and look at the fields, thinking of the way power bends and of the cost of making it bend. She did not claim to have cured the disease of a broader society. She had made one man pay in ways his peers would notice, and had by doing so altered the calculus of local governance. That was not small. It was also not total. She had not dismantled the system that made a man like Leighton possible. She had simply shown that a system's pillar could be put into doubt. On an evening years after the 40th night, when a gentle rain tapped the porch and the quarter's lamps glowed like small tired stars, a neighbor's son asked Teresa in an idle way whether she regretted what she had done. She considered the question and, as she often did, weighed it in terms of small things. The life of a boy spared a beating, a household preserved in the messy arithmetic of kindness, the dignity of those who had been forced to bow. When Teresa spoke, she did not justify herself so much as report. "I did what had to be done," she said, her voice steady in the dark. "I tried to keep harm from falling where I could stop it, but I would not say I was free of cost. There was cost. There always is. It is not a clean trade. Nothing that uproots the lawless in this world is." There was a silence, and then the boy nodded as if satisfied. Teresa picked up her broom and resumed her sweeping, the motion of it like a measure of time. The shards she had once gathered were long since gone, ground into dust, or kept in a small wooden box at the back of a trunk. They existed as memory, rather than as fact in the household's daily routine. The story of the Colonel's decline remained in people's mouths in different forms. A solemn warning that unchecked pride invites consequences, a cautionary tale about the fragility of human systems and the ways in which the mighty can be humbled. Some told it with sympathy for the Colonel, others with reverence for Teresa's cunning. The truth of it was more complicated. It was a history of a community where legal recourse failed to correct an injustice, and where those who had been wronged had to find a remedy outside institutions that protected their oppressors. Teresa kept to the margins by choice, but her decision had a power of its own. She learned that invisibility can be a shield and a knife. It can preserve, but it can also wound by allowing the person invisible to do things that the visible cannot. She accepted that ambiguity as the cost of a certain kind of agency. The community around her changed slowly. Some men altered their habits of cruelty, perhaps cautious now of the precariousness of reputation. Others deepened their defenses, building new rituals of power elsewhere. Life, as it always will, rearranged itself. When she was old, Teresa would sit by a window in the quarters and watch the cotton wave, its pale flowers trembling like a sea in the wind. She would think of days of counting and of notches in the box she had kept, and she would wonder often whether she had been right to choose the method she chose. She would recall the line of the 40th night, the sound that had made a man fire into the ceiling, the glass that had shattered, the hush of the courtroom and the banker's note. All of it sat like a ledger in her mind, adding up to a sum she could neither simplify nor wholly explain. That is how the story rests. A woman's patience and a colony of small actions reshaping a man's fate, with consequences that spread beyond the initial wrong. It is a tale of a plantation in Mississippi, 1860, told as a dramatization inspired by oral histories and tradition, not as an assertion of verified fact. It asks what is justice when the law will not reach it, and what price is just to make the powerful accountable. Teresa, broom in hand, chose to remain invisible because it kept her free to do the work she believed necessary. In that invisibility, there was also a kind of surrender, a recognition that real justice cannot always be neat, and that sometimes the balance is a bitter thing to carry. She swept the last of the dust from the parlor floor and set the broom upright. The morning light found her there, a small figure in the doorway, holding the ordinary instruments of a life that had been both shaped by necessity and shaped lives in return. If this story made you think about the line between retribution and justice, share it with someone who needs to consider the same question, and subscribe to follow more stories that explore the shadowed places where power and resistance meet.